We're in Hebrews chapter 2, and with a little bit of luck and skipping a lot of material, we're going to get through verse 9 tonight. It's probably the largest portion we've looked at over the year. In Hebrews chapter 1, we were introduced to Jesus, who was superior in every way to the angelic world. And at that point, we took a little side trip, looked at angels, and looked at how the Hebrew people viewed them and the elevated position they gave them, and noted that part of the challenge of the church historically dealing with the Jewish people has been to convince them that this Jesus, who was a man, who was crucified, was higher than angels, and that important to them. So we looked at some of that, and we'll pick up more of that in this chapter here with it. The section is going to deal with two real big issues. One is the fact that Jesus suffered and died, which, as we said, is a stumbling block to the Jewish people. And then the second part of that, he's going to emphasize just how significant our redemption is to the overall plan of God for mankind. Tremendously exciting passage when it comes to that aspect of theology. The aim is to show us not only that Jesus is higher than the angels, but to introduce us to the glorious destiny that's ours as Christians. And the verses that we have now are going to be a kind of a transition in some ways to all that he's going to say about the humiliation and the glorification of Jesus, and the fact that we become joint heirs with Jesus in terms of that. And the section is fairly easy to outline, because the first few verses, verses 5 through the first part of verse 8, is largely a quote from Psalm 8. And then the last part of it, verses 8 and 9, is an interpretation of what that means to us as Christians in terms of God's provision. What is very, very exciting about this passage is that it gives us some insight into the challenges of the early church to take the Old Testament and understand it in relationship to the promises of the Messiah. And there are a number of rather challenging issues that come to play in this section. As noted, the opening section is verbatim of Psalm 8, verses 4 to 6. The challenge is that the author quotes this directly from the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And the Greek translation of the Old Testament has a significant difference from the Hebrew Old Testament. So in the process of translating it from Hebrew to Greek, they made a shift in the wording of it. In the Hebrew Old Testament, it is very definitely a reference to man in relationship to God, whereas the Septuagint looks at it in terms of our relationship to the angelic world, trading the word God for angel. And it's legitimate, but it was certainly an interesting challenge. We'll get into that a little bit later, maybe about 5 minutes to 8. Originally, Psalm 8 referred to man and our position before God. And here, the writer takes it and says, well, in addition to that, we also need to look at the relationship of Jesus to the angels, not just to God, but to the angels, and how that plays out. Originally, what he's saying is that God created man to have a very special position in his creation, and that was lost. However, Jesus, because he was one of us, is going to provide that back for us. But in the process of becoming one of us, he lowers himself, at least for a time, from that angelic world. So we have this balance between the two of them. It's going to talk about Jesus being crowned with glory and honor. And if you want to have some fun, read 10 commentators. You'll get 12 opinions as to when that takes place. When was he crowned with glory and honor? Some good arguments for the resurrection, other good arguments for the millennium, some good arguments for the new heaven and the new earth, and so forth. The problem that we have often in understanding this is that salvation, the redemptive plan of God, is on one sense complete because the price was paid in full on the cross. We become children of God, as we'll see later on next week. On the other hand, we're not yet there. And it's that complete, but yet not totally realized redemption plan. And what's present, what's future. And again, when we look in terms of Jesus and what he provides, the timing of some of these things is not all that clear. The reality of them, the bottom line of them, is very, very clear. It's a problem we looked at early on in the first chapter, verse 2, almost before we got started. It talks about these last days. And what exactly does the author mean by the last days? Another interesting problem in terms of this is that it talks about angels ruling, and the Old Testament never specifically talks about the angels ruling over aspects of mankind. It's the Septuagint does, again, makes it quite clear in its translation of Deuteronomy 32 that angels are given some form of temporary rule over mankind. Daniel is where we find it perhaps clearest, and talks about that. And in Daniel talks about angels and describes them as the prince of Persia and the prince of Greece, implying that they rule over that. But it's not exactly spelled out clearly for us. And so we'll have to look at, how that argument fits into everything. And then one other issue that we'll talk about, it says that Jesus was made a little lower than the angels. And what does he mean by little? Because in the Greek language, that little could have a couple of different meanings. It could mean a little lower, which is the way the NIV translates it, or for a little time, which again, we understand he took on man, form of man, was resurrected, and now reigns in glory. So both of them fit. How exactly does it all fit together? Fortunately, I'm done. Dan's on. He'll get you back into the passage and explain it all. Dan?
Before we do that, I do have a brief outline that's not in your handout that I want to share with you. And I did a little PowerPoint just because I haven't done any PowerPoints recently, and I kind of miss them. So this is one possible way of looking at a chunk here of Hebrews chapter 2. Verses 5 to 18, based on what Jesus' death and resurrection accomplished for mankind. Today, we're talking about chapter 2, verses 5 through 9. how he recaptured our lost destiny. As we look in the future weeks 10 to 13, he recovers our lost unity. 14 and 15, he releases us from satanic bondage. 16 to 18, he restores us in times of failure. And I don't know about you guys, but I tend to fail quite a bit. So I'm really glad he restores us. This is just another possible way of breaking down a couple of verses here in Hebrews chapter 2. That's the PowerPoint. That's all it is. Sorry. Mom, would you go ahead and read for us Hebrews chapter 2, verse 5?
It is not to angels that he has subjected the world to come, about which we are speaking.
I like that. I like it catches the reader's attention when he begins with a negative. So usually we as humans like to do positive stuff. Well, he's a good guy, but and then we go into how bad he is. We start with the positive and end with the negative. And here the writer of Hebrews starts with the negative right up front. It is not to the angels that he's subjecting the world to come. Dad mentioned a little bit earlier that he's trying to emphasize that angels are not going to be ruling later on, whenever that time is. Very interestingly, and Dad also mentioned this in his things to consider. There are hints in the Bible, particularly in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. There are passages in the scripture that talk about angels having some kind of control over our present world. Dad mentioned Deuteronomy 32, verse 8, which is an interesting passage because it seems to have said one thing and then got translated into something else. If you look at various translations, it talks about either the sons of God, plural sons of God, or some translations call it the sons of Israel. When the Old Testament talks about the sons of God, plural sons of God, almost always it's talking about angels. Whether Deuteronomy is actually talking about angels, we don't know, because all the passages around it are all talking about humans. And so some translators have decided to instead of translating it sons of God, have translated sons of Israel to make it more human, I guess. But if it is, but the original seems to be sons of God. And so whether angels are having some kind of control, that it basically, that passage says God divided up the world into its various areas, and each area has the sons of God in it. And so some have suggested, does that mean angels have control, or are they talking about human beings? God has divided up the world into various geopolitical or geographical areas, and people groups have their locations. We're not exactly sure. Dad also mentioned the book of Daniel, chapter 10. And I just want to throw this out there that we'll be talking more about Daniel chapter 10 at some point during this coming summer when we do our potluck supper, because the potluck sermon series, because Bill has already turned in this request to me for this coming summer. But it talks very interestingly about Daniel's there, and he's been praying, and all of a sudden he has this vision of an angel that shining glory, and we know it's an angel because the angel says, I have been sent from God. So it's not God himself showing up to Daniel, but the angel says to Daniel, I would have been here earlier, 21 days earlier, but I was kept from coming to you. And he names actually probably a demon that's called the Prince of Persia. Well, we know that demons are fallen angels, so it's an angel, but a fallen angel who's the prince of Persia. And this angel shows up to Daniel and says, this prince of Persia stopped me from coming to you until Michael, the archangel, showed up, and we beat him up a bit, and now I'm coming here to talk to you. And as soon as I'm done, this is really strange. And then this angel says, as soon as I'm done talking with you, Daniel, I'm going to go back, and I've got to go back and defeat the prince of Persia and the prince of Greece. And we're like, well, so we're going to talk about that one in the summer, Bill, just a little bit more about what's going on there. How that applies to here is that there seems to be angels and or demons that have some kind of control over our present earth. Even in the book of Revelation, as God is pouring out the bowls of wrath on mankind for their sin during the time of tribulation, there's an interesting passage about angels, 4 angels that are holding back the four winds from blowing across the land, and they seem to be the ones that control what's going on in the north and the south and the east and the west. What those winds are, that's for another topic, whether it's actual wind or whether it's God's ministering angels that aren't allowed to minister because God's wrath is being poured out, whatever. But there does seem to be hints that angels are involved somehow in having some kind of modicum of control over our present world. Hebrews 2:5 says, however, that's going to end. Okay, it is a finite time that they will have control over it. It only seems maybe parts of the earth, maybe, but it's definitely not forever. It is a temporary and finite control that they have. And when we get to the world to come, whether that's the millennial kingdom or the new heaven and the new earth, Jesus is in control, and we as humans will get to reign with Jesus, and believers are pictured as reigning with Jesus during this millennium throughout the New Testament. Revelation chapter 20 verse 6 talks about that, Mom.
Blessed and holy are those who share in the first resurrection. The second death has no power over them, but they will be priests of God and of Christ and will reign with him for 1,000 years.
And so, yeah, we get to reign, those of us who are believers, we get to reign with Jesus. Angels don't. Angels might have some control over things here on earth now, a limited control, but Jesus is going to be in ultimate control. And when we get to join him in heaven, we get to join and reign with him. So that's it's, when the writer of Hebrews says it's not to angels that he has subjected the world to come. That phrase to subjected the world is a military phrase, oftentimes used about armies that are subjugating countries, and the way a general will arrange his troops to make sure he has complete control over everything. And that's what that, and this passage in Hebrews is saying, Jesus has that ultimate control like a military general. Angels don't. And it's the purpose of Jesus on earth. And I think in your handout, there's a whole list there: 1 Corinthians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians. Pretty much anytime Paul talks about military stuff, that's kind of where we're getting a lot of this same kind of phraseology and analogies coming in. And the world to come, again, the Greek word here is world, that denotes kind of the inhabited world. And we're not talking about world as in all of creation, the cosmos, the sun, the moon, the stars, the galaxies. The world to come is the created, inhabited, where we are living right now kind of world. And when he's talking about the world to come, probably he's talking about that world when Jesus comes back and sets up his millennial kingdom here on earth, and possibly even the new heaven and the new earth that we inhabit. That's this idea of the age to come or the world to come is really in the New Testament broken down into those two different kind of ideas. This millennial kingdom where Christ is going to come back, and for 1,000 years he's going to reign on earth, and everything, kind of the fulfillment of that Davidic covenant, the covenant with King David, that his reign would last forever. And that's the first part. And then the second part that's also developed in the New Testament is this the second the new heaven and the new earth. This earth that we're living on now at the end of the millennial period seems to be destroyed, and we get a new heaven and a new earth without any sin, without any disease or anything like that. Generally, when they're talking about this world to come in the New Testament, they're talking about the millennial kingdom most of the time, but there is that second part. In the millennial kingdom, there is a physical world and a spiritual world, just as there is in our world today. It seems that this millennial kingdom, it began, many people feel, began with Christ's death and resurrection, and it's going to extend until it is completed with his return, the return of Christ. And there's a spiritual kingdom and a physical kingdom, and however you want to look at that, to whatever extent you want to see this encompassing the salvation kingdom, the point is very clear that it's here in Hebrews that angels aren't in control. That's kind of the whole point of it. Hebrews 13 talks about the world to come as the new heaven and the new earth. In both the millennial kingdom and in the new heaven and the new earth, the Messiah is the ruler, not angels. And I guess that goes back to our whole thesis of these first two couple of chapters, that Jesus as the Messiah is superior to the angels. He's the one that's in control. Mankind is seen as the heirs of salvation. And that takes us ultimately to the world that is to come, when our salvation will be complete. Yes, Christ died on the cross and completed our salvation, but we still live in a world of sin. And at some point that salvation will be completed. The completed salvation will be even more completed, I guess you could say, when Christ sets up the kingdom. He ends this chapter, this verse 5, with about which we were speaking, and that just ties us back into what he was talking about in chapter 1. The whole angel thing is mentioned again. One of the message of Hebrews is that Jesus is going to reign, and when he does, he will be supreme over his enemies. And when we go back to Hebrews chapter 1, verse 8, it speaks that his throne will last forever.
We are doing really well. We're through one verse. It's only a half hour.
Yeah, we're doing good. Only got 3 more.
Yeah, a few more to go. Artie, you have Hebrews 2:6.
But there is a place where someone has testified, "What is mankind that you are mindful of them? A son of man that you care for him."
There's a place where someone has testified. Well, you can't get much more specific than that.
I heard a
Somewhere
story
in
once.
the Old Testament, somebody said something, and I'm going to quote it, is basically what he's saying. It's not probably as vague when he wrote it as it would maybe appear today. You know, when I'd be preaching, or sometimes I'd simply say, you know, the Bible says, and I don't necessarily tell you where or who said it, and so forth. No specific reference. In this case, we know, because we have the Old Testament and we've gone back and checked it, that this comes from, as we've noted, Psalm 8. And that's specifically what he had in mind. I think it's rather interesting that this passage was apparently well enough known in the early church that all he had to do was quote it. And there's a Jewish Christian rabbi on television, and that every now and then has an ad on and says the scriptures say that the day will come when 10 Gentiles will grab the garment of a Jew and say, "Let me go with you because." And the first time I heard that, I thought, yeah, but I'm not sure exactly where that is. It's in Zechariah. I looked it up to make sure. You know, using something that we don't know. If, on the other hand, you know, I'm preaching and I say, God's word says, "For God so loved the world," you know immediately what I'm talking about. And this would indicate, by writing this way, that the early church, the Jewish Christians to whom he was writing, was familiar with this passage. And as far as the writer is concerned, it really doesn't matter who wrote it in terms of the human instrument or which of the Old Testament books it happens to be found in. The reality for him is that God spoke it, and God was making this statement through some human instrument. It's an interesting formula. He's going to use the same thing in chapter 4 and again in chapter 5. Somebody says, and that is a unique approach to scripture found only in the book of Hebrews. But I'm excited to think that he felt free to quote from this, knowing that the readers would know what it is. And then he says, "What is man that you are mindful of him, the Son of Man that you care for him?" As we've already noted, this is a quote from Psalm 8, but in the original, it was not seen as referring to the Messiah. The ancient rabbis knew that there were certain verses and promises that they could count on being fulfilled when the Messiah came. And they listed them, they knew what they were, and so forth. There were other passages that the early church looks at and says, oh, that also refers to the Messiah, but we didn't realize it until after the Messiah came, and so forth. I think one of the key examples of that is Isaiah 53. The ancient rabbis never saw that suffering servant passage as having anything to do with the Messiah. Shocked that anybody would think that way. And then we come to the New Testament and we find Christ on the cross and so forth. And the early church says, wait a minute, that was speaking of him. And that's the way it is with this passage here. And incidentally, that passage is quoted in Matthew, Ephesians, and First Corinthians. And every time it quotes that passage from Psalm 8, it's always doing it in reference to Jesus. With it, when David, assuming David wrote it, he was thinking in terms of Adam, to whom God gave dominion over the creation, said, I'm going to assign you to the responsibilities. And then that was lost. And what he's presenting here is that what Paul calls the second Adam is ultimately going to control everything and put it back under his control. And the idea of Jesus being the Son of Man comes from Daniel chapter 7 and verse 13. And that one reads,
In my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence.
With that, we begin to get a concept of the Son of Man connected to the Messiah. When David wrote it, he talks in terms of man and the Son of Man. And we look back on it and say, oh, yeah, because it refers to the Messiah, that's two different characters, mankind and Jesus. When he wrote it, I suspect that all he was doing was being a good Hebrew poetic writer, using parallelism, which was typical of what they did. So rather than simply repeat himself, man and man, it was man and the Son of Man balanced out together. I get excited when I think about that here is God directing the scriptures, giving David somehow or other through the ministry of the Holy Spirit or angels or whatever, the insight to write this when he really doesn't know what he's talking about. But God does. And that becomes, I think, very, very powerful. One of the interesting things is that Paul in particular sets up the parallelism that is so important to understanding what is taking place here. And he does it particularly in Ephesians 15, where he talks about Adam, mankind, through whom death came, and then Jesus, whom he calls the second Adam, through whom life came. And later in that same chapter 15, Paul's going to compare the Adam of Genesis, who was the dust of the earth, and the second Adam who came from heaven. Artie, I think you have 1 Corinthians 15:45, where he calls Jesus the last Adam or the second Adam.
So it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living being. The last Adam, a life-giving spirit.
So we have the duality here that we need to see is built into the writer's understanding of the role that the incarnate Jesus is playing in our redemption with it. And it's interesting that, we've got this passage and he says, hey, this really is referring to Jesus and what Jesus does in the midst of creation. Exactly how that fits in again is a full study all in itself. The writer feels free to take that Septuagint and translate that Hebrew that said God to angels to show that Jesus is going to be higher than the angels, even though for a little bit of time he's less than that. He says, man, little o, what is man? The word he uses here is basically the word for male, general term for mankind. And again, what becomes interesting is that the phrase Son of Man can be used in several different ways in the Old Testament. And it's up to commentators, studies, when we study it, to put it in the context of it. It was definitely a messianic title that was used here. In fact, it's the most common title for Jesus in the gospel accounts, but is also used in the Old Testament to just talk about us. And so God can write through Ezekiel, and Ezekiel says, Son of Man, prophesy what I say. He's talking about him. That got me out of that. Dan, you're on the little lower.
Hebrews 2:7, Mom.
You made him a little lower than the angels. You crowned him with glory and honor.
This is going to be one of the shortest verses we are going to discuss, the shortest discussion about a verse that we're going to do. There's a couple of phrases in here that I do want to look at. Made him. Interesting that Scripture makes it clear that there is a plan of redemption. That redemption has a specific purpose to it. We were created. God, Jesus was made a little bit lower. There's a purpose to it. It wasn't just an accident. God didn't just wake up one morning and say, "Oh, I guess I had to do something about sin." No, he made Jesus a little lower than the angels. Little again can imply a position that Jesus was above the angels, and then Jesus became a little bit lower than the angels when he became human. Phone's ringing. And now he's back above him, or it could be a length of time. He came as a baby and was a human for a little bit of. I mean, if you remember that Jesus is God, he is eternal, and his 33 years on earth compared to eternity is a very little time. So that's kind of what might be going on here. Interestingly, the writer of Hebrews talks about you crowned him with glory and honor. And interestingly, this is actually not found in a lot of the early translations of the Bible, early copies that we have, whether it was added in later. It is mentioned in verse 9. Crowned with glory and honor. And so some have suggested it might have gotten accidentally in the translation, in the copying, somehow it got moved or copied wrong. So since we're going to talk about it in verse 9, since Dad's going to talk about it in verse 9, I'm going to skip it now. We'll let him do it. So, thanks, Dad, so much.
Yeah,
So that's verse 7. See how short that was? Verse 8, Mom.
And put everything under their feet. In putting everything under them, God left nothing that is not subject to them. Yet at present, we do not see everything subject to them.
And putting everything under his feet, and putting everything under him, God, kind of this passage here refers back to Genesis chapter 1. And particularly the end of that chapter. Mankind in God's plan at creation that he told Adam he was to have was that he was going to have leadership, ownership, rulership. King James, I think, has dominion over the land, the sea, the sky, the every creature that was created. Genesis 1:26, Mom, tells us that.
Then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground.
Now that's what man was created to do, was to rule over everything. Unfortunately, sin entered the world. And following the sin of mankind, the fall of man, nature became an enemy of man. But even though there was that, the nature became that enemy, God's original plan still stands, even though sin has made it more difficult. Again, putting under his control, a military term. Again, military was an important part of Roman world, and so the writer of Hebrews, as he is writing, is in that Roman world, and the military was everywhere. And so Paul uses a lot of military terms, and so here does the writer of Hebrews. talking about having control over, bringing troops under command. And then it says everything under control, put everything under his feet. Written in such a way as to clearly show it means everything, nothing is excluded. And then the writer of Hebrews needs to make sure we understand that that was the plan, but it hasn't been fulfilled yet. Sin has caused a bump in the road, a hiccup, if you would. Yet at present, we do not see everything subject to him. An interesting picture here, and certainly a huge understatement. It's not quite perfect yet. We haven't gotten there yet. Mankind is going to have complete dominion over the physical and spiritual world along with Jesus. And we can say, as we look around, yeah, we've done fairly well with some areas of the physical world. I like the fact that we have internet and air conditioning and this week heat in the houses and things that we can control those kinds of things. But when we look at the spiritual world, yeah, we have some real problems there, don't we? We have so little control over our emotions, over the inhumanity that occurs in our world. And we can't miss out on the writer of Hebrews phrasing here, not yet. Not yet. It will be fulfilled at some point in the future when Jesus comes and sets up the millennial kingdom, when the new heaven and the new earth comes. God has not forgotten the plan in the Garden of Eden for mankind to have dominion, to rule over. But that's going to come with and fulfilled ultimately with Jesus. That's when it's going to happen.
Mom, verse 9.
But we do see Jesus, who was made lower than the angels for a little while, now crowned with glory and honor because he suffered death, so that by the grace of God, he might taste death for everyone.
But we see Jesus.
That make a good sermon title.
Oh, it is very definitely. I wonder if the writer had been using my desktop computer when he got to write that, if he didn't switch from a 12-point font to a 24 or a 48, and as bold a print as we can. But we see Jesus. Shouting it, all capital letters or whatever. This, by the way, is the first use of the actual name Jesus in the book of Hebrews, and it's used to emphasize his humanity, his incarnation. He's not simply a good man, but he's the incarnate God, and he stands in marked contrast to sinful man and everything that we lost because of that sin, especially the spiritual losses that were ours. He uses that Jesus to point out his humanity because that's going to be critical to an understanding of him taking our place with it. And I think it's a reminder that, we need to see Jesus often. As Dan says, it's a good sermon in a 2 or 3. But I think we need to see Jesus in both his humanity and his deity. In his humanity, and the writer of Hebrews is going to really focus on this several times. In his humanity, he understands us. He goes through the same things we go through and so on. And in his deity has a power to overcome them, to control them and so forth with it. because he is both fully God and fully man, he's able to pay the price of our redemption with it. He says, but we see Jesus. And I think that's a rather interesting comparison. Okay, we've got man who failed, was supposed to have control of things, blew it with his sin. But compare that to Jesus, the predicament of mankind and the sin that overwhelms us. Look to Jesus, see him on the throne, and everything will become subject to him. And here again, he says he was made a little lower than the angels. We've looked at that little a couple of times already. In the context of which this is, it's definitely referring to a position, but it's also a period of time because we, as Dan said, 33 years is not a long time compared to eternity. So what we have here is Jesus is made a little lower than the angels, which is the wonder of the incarnation. John 1:14, the word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Incarnation. Secondly, he's going to tell us he suffered. And this is going to be amplified when he talks about him tasting death. But that's not the end of the story. He's exalted and glorified. The writer goes on, now crowned with glory and honor because he suffered death, so that the grace of God, he might taste death for everyone. Crowned, again, interesting because the idea of a crown in the ancient world had two different uses, two different crowns, and both of them fit Jesus. So I'm not sure which one the writer was specifically referring to. The word referred to the crown of a king, a sovereign. When he ascended to the throne, he was given a crown to signify his rule. But they had a different crown, different use of the word, and they used that to talk about the wreath that was given to the victor in athletic contests when he won the contest, or given to a general when he returned from battle after winning it, and so forth. What's interesting is that Jesus is the sovereign, and he's also the conqueror of sin and death. I think the difference is that the wreath that is given to a conqueror faded. The crown that was given to the King of Kings is permanent. The psalm moves as we go through it from Jesus' humiliation and becoming a man and suffering, and takes us to the glorification where he's sovereign once again, everything under his control. As Son of Man, the creation we lost as mankind comes under his control. And then the writer can't help but throw in, this is all because of the grace of God. Puts everything in terms of our redemption, our restoration, of fellowship, of placing his creation squarely on God, who chose to do it because of his love. This was a typical Pauline statement, although I don't think Paul wrote this one. Typical statement in the early church. We're saved by grace, we live by grace. Everything about our relationship with God falls under that grace. And he says here he tasted death. Now I have to put that in the context in which it was written. Every now and then we'll have something on the table, something like broccoli or, asparagus or something like that. And I'll say, oh, no thanks. And my wife will say to me, look, just taste it. Maybe you'll like it. No, I can tell by looking at it. But anyway, when he says he tasted death, he's not saying that Jesus reached over and took a little bit of death just so he'd know what it was like. It was a phrase that was used in ancient time to express participation in the full experience. It was not merely that he died, but that in his death he experienced all of the physical aspects of that death on the cross. His body hurt just as much as the two that were on the cross beside him on cross. He understood it all, with the added aspect that he bore it with our sins on him. With the aspect of the messianic office is one that we understand in terms of the suffering, but it was very, very difficult for Jews in the first century to get a hold of it. How was this Jesus as a man? How do we explain that suffering? Well, the writer of Hebrews is saying, I can explain it to you because he underwent it so that he could take our place with it. He died. He says he died for everyone. Okay, that means that nobody's going to be lost. Nope. The scriptures make it very clear that justification, what Jesus did on the cross, is available to all mankind. We say in theology it was sufficient for all, efficient only for those who apply it in themselves in their own lives by trusting Jesus. This whole thing of him tasting death for us is what the theologians would call the substitutionary atonement. He took our place and died for us. By his death, we can once again have that which is lost. Dan, I'm going to give you the last 20 minutes.
Yeah, that's not going to take us 20 minutes. So we've only got about 3 or 4. So, but that's where we're gonna stop for tonight. We've gone through verse 9, I think. But let me just give us a brief summary to remind us once again of this passage and what's going on here. And I think this might also be in your handout, but it's important to review because we've talked about some pretty heavy things tonight. And so here's what the author of Hebrews here in chapter 2, for the couple of verses here, he talks about God creating man and giving to mankind a position of dominion over all of creation. Genesis chapter 1, Genesis chapter 2, and that's the ideal for which man was created for. It was a glorious position, and it placed us above the angels. And then Genesis chapter 3 happened, and mankind sinned and lost it all. And instead of the ideal, we now have the actual, what it actually is, the difference between the ideal and the actual. And what a wide gulf that separates mankind as we are now from what we were intended to be. We were intended to have dominion over creation, and now we are weak, failure, the temptation, we're defeated, frustrated, definitely not a dominion kind of language. Verse 8 tells us all that's what we all was supposed to be subjected to mankind, but it isn't. It isn't anymore because of sin. And third, into man's defeat, frustration, and failure comes Jesus to make it right again and to provide a way in which the actual that was the plan can be restored to our ideal, what was intended, what actually is. We can, our actual can be restored to the ideal. What we are now can be restored to what was. That which is lost can be regained. Paul explained this all in 1 Corinthians 15. We're not going to dig into 1 Corinthians 15 tonight. You can if you want to later. Fallen man is restored to a position greater than the angels because Jesus, who was greater than the angels, became like man, to suffer like man and to die as a man for all of mankind. And now we see Jesus crowned with glory, and we get to be with him and rule as well. That's Hebrews 2:5 through 9.